Going under the knife is scary business for a lot of people. Having gone under the knife myself 5 times as recently as last year, I can say from my own experience that surgery terrifies me. And even after all those times, it still terrifies me today. Now, just imagine it. It's the 19th century, the Victorian era, and you have to go under the knife. Oh joy. And specifically, you have to get one of your legs amputated. I don't know why, you just do, okay? You just have to get it done. And you are one of those unfortunate souls that rolled the dice and it landed on you living during a period where there was no anesthesia, there were no antibiotics, and doctors had no understanding of germs or cleanliness. And you're going to be wide awake for this procedure with nothing but a bottle of whiskey. And let's pray that it's the good stuff. You have a 46% chance of surviving this surgery, and you know this. You're 100% aware as you're about to be cut open. In comes your surgeon, a man named Dr. Robert Liston, also known as the fastest knife in the West End. And even though you're living in a world where a surgery such as this could prove to be very catastrophic for you, you've got one of the most famous and fastest working surgeons of the time operating on you. You're strapped down to the table with your surgeon's assistants holding you down. Dr. Liston, your surgeon, looks at you in your terrified eyes and says, "This is gonna hurt like hell, but I promise it'll be quick." And your surgeon, Dr. Liston, he starts amputating your leg. You start screaming in agony, and before you know it, your leg is gone. And just within 2.5 minutes, might I add. However, just one little issue. Dr. Liston has not only taken your leg, but he has also taken one of your testicles. But you know what? Thank God that you and I do not live in the 19th century. We were one of the lucky ones. But this person really did exist, and this accident really did happen. And this doctor who did it, he really did it. And this doctor, Robert Liston, was a 19th century Scottish surgeon who is probably most known for having a recorded 300% mortality rate. But he was also one of the most influential and most talented surgeons of his time. What? He was. Now hear me out. The 300% mortality rate is only synonymous with one procedure he performed, not his entire career. However, that one surgery has tainted this surgeon's legacy and his entire career. And it's really unfortunate because this guy made a lot of contributions to medicine. I'm not saying that everyone is saying, oh, this guy is horrible, 300% mortality rate, but there are some people that think that this applies across the board. But I do have to keep it real. Those hiccups in his career are pretty interesting. And my channel is called Old Dirty History after all, so I want to talk about them. I want to talk about all of his surgical mishaps, including why he has this 300% mortality rate tied to him. But I also want to talk about all the cool things he did and all the major contributions he made to medicine. Dr. Robert Liston was born on October 28, 1794 in West Lothian, Scotland. In his youth, he was educated by his father, who was a minister. But then at just 16 years old, he began studying at the University of Edinburgh, and by just 18 he had started medical school. In 1816 he moved to London to work at the London Hospital, and then he would go on to work at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He then returned to Edinburgh to teach anatomy. He would eventually become a staff surgeon with the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. It was during this time in Liston's career that he really began to make a name for himself, and part of this was due to the fact that Liston was such a skilled surgeon that he would take on patients from the Royal Infirmary that were turned down, that were deemed as not survivable, but Liston saw it differently. And he actually ended up being accused of stealing their patients, which Liston completely denied. This accusation that Liston was poaching the infirmary's patients led to Liston being temporarily banished from the infirmary. He would eventually be reinstated, and then by the age of 34, he was appointed a professor of surgery at University College Hospital in London. But he was hated by a lot of his peers, especially the older surgeons who were really set in their ways. And this was because Liston would criticize their antiquated ways and methods, and he wouldn't do it behind their back. Well, he probably did do it behind their back, but he would also do it to their faces, and they didn't like that. And it wasn't just seasoned surgeons that he criticized. He also criticized newbies, his students. If it was anything that they did that he felt as though it was inadequate, he called it out. He called it as he saw it. And Liston, he was very advanced for his time. He was very clean and he was very organized. And this isn't because he knew of the existence of germs, but more so probably because he was just a very clean and organized man. And so he brought that quality of life to the surgical table. And again, this was the Victorian era, and for the surgeons of the time, a sign of a hard-working surgeon doing his thing was a doctor walking around with an apron on covered in blood and guts and pus and probably urine too, and maybe a little vomit, some shit, just a bunch of nasty fluids. This was seen as a good thing. That means you did your job, you are working hard, go you, go team. Bloodier the surgeon, the better the surgeon. Me personally, as a patient, I'd rather keep my blood in my body. The less bloodier, the better. But hey, what do I know? Liston was an exception to this rule. He was all about, like I said, the cleanliness, being neat and tidy. He hated messy surgeons. He was so clean compared to his peers. I mean, with the exception of, from time to time, putting his surgical knife in his mouth while his hands were occupied when he was, cutting people open, which is fucking disgusting. It really is. But again, this is the 19th century and there were worse things. Okay, there were worse things. But he always used clean sponges. He washed his work area as well as his hands. And he even shaved the surgical site prior to operating. Liston became such a sought-after surgeon because of his skills with the knife that surgeons from all over the place would come to visit and watch him do his thing. And because there weren't specialists during this time, Liston, he did everything. I mean, he operated on eyes, breasts, ear, nose, throat. However, his specialty was amputation, and he was good at it. He was the fastest surgeon at amputation. And during this time, speed was very important. The faster the surgeon, the greater the surgeon. Because remember, this is before anesthesia, blood transfusions, as well as antibiotics. And so the longer the patient endured the procedure, the higher the risk of them dying. And when I say this man was fast, he was fast. He could chop off your leg in 2.5 minutes flat on average. And so because of this, Liston was a highly sought after surgeon. And he knew he was the shit. Liston was extremely cocky. He would perform these operations within a surgical theater, and medical students would surround him with pocket watches ready to time him. And Liston would yell, "Now gentlemen, time me." And not only was he really fast, he also revolutionized amputations. The usual method for amputation was creating a circular incision, and then the surgeon would wrap their arm behind the limb and then sweep around its circumference, and the scalpel is then pulled around the limb. This wasn't the most convenient method because this left a layer of flesh that was hard to pull over the cut end of the bone. The method that Liston created looks something like this. The surgeon creates a U-shaped flap that can be turned over, and once the flaps are pulled back, the bone is left exposed. To do this, the surgeon cuts into the flesh parallel to the bone, and then the surgeon can peel back the flesh, exposing the bone. The surgeon could then easily access the bone and then sever it. There is a reason why I became a librarian/archivist. To not do that type of shit. I have a fond appreciation for doctors, especially the ones that cut body parts open. Somebody's got to do it, but I ain't that somebody. Now, overall, Liston had a mortality rate of 1 in every 6 patients. And this was over the course of 66 amputations across the years 1835 to 1840. While this sounds horrible for contemporary standards, if we compare him to his peers of the time, this is actually pretty good. For comparison, St. Bartholomew's Hospital had a mortality rate of 1 in every 4. But like I said at the beginning of this video, Liston, he had some boo-boos. He had some big boo-boos that occurred in his career. And these boo-boos became very notable in medical history. The first boo-boo we'll take a look at is a procedure that Liston performed on a small boy, or that he was supposed to perform. This boy had a pulsating tumor in his neck. Liston was in the middle of an argument with his house surgeon about what this tumor really was. Liston believed that it was just an abscess of the skin and not a very dangerous aneurysm of the carotid artery. Liston said, "Pooh. Who ever heard of an aneurysm in a boy so young? That's not possible." He proceeded to take a knife out of his pocket and cut into the boy's neck. And lo and behold, it was not just some skin abscess. The boy bled to death. Liston's next notable boo-boo that I'm going to talk about, I actually mentioned at the very beginning of this video. Liston was performing a simple amputation on a man's leg. The procedure took just 2.5 minutes, which was his average. And not only did he take the man's leg, but again, he also took one of the man's testicles. Just imagine that man on the operating table and his reaction. What would you do if that was you? I know if that was me, I would not have been the only person who lost a testicle that day. That's for sure. Speaking of testicles, here's another noteworthy procedure that Liston did during his career that wasn't really a boo-boo, but it was definitely noteworthy. Liston operated on a man who was living with a 45-pound tumor on his nutsack. It was so huge that the poor guy had to wheel that thing around in a wheelbarrow. Just imagine. The thing measured 42 inches in circumference. The surgery was described as being a shower bath from all the blood loss. The patient sunk off the table and he flatlined after Liston finished removing the testicle. But after being given a strong pint of whiskey, he came back. He was magically revived. And within just 3 weeks, he was discharged from the hospital and lived out the rest of his life. And now, for Liston's most notorious case, I give you the 300% mortality rate surgery. Liston was, again, working on a simple amputation procedure. He amputated the person's leg within his standard 2.5 minute or less period. However, during the procedure, Liston accidentally amputated the fingers of one of his assistants, who died later from gangrene. He also accidentally sliced through the coattails of a surgical spectator. After witnessing Liston's assistant have their fingers chopped off and watching this fool with the knife come near them, the spectator was so terrified that he dropped dead. I am not kidding. He was so freaked out, he died right there and then in the middle of the surgery.
I'm sorry.
Then, to make matters worse, the actual patient also did not survive. They died from gangrene after the surgery was over, which dying from gangrene after an amputation during this time wasn't uncommon. You know, it did happen from time to time, but couple that with all the other mishaps that happened during the procedure, it boosted it up to a 300% mortality rate. I'm just trying to picture in my head this man in the middle of the surgery and all these people dying. This is legit what I'm picturing. What the Again, so glad that me and you, the both of us, I'm glad we don't live during this period. I'm giving him a hard time, but you gotta admit, that is some wild shit. But the sad thing is that he's commonly associated with this 300% mortality rate as if it was his whole career. But this was the only procedure that this applies to. It never happened again. Not just with him, but any other surgeon. And I hope it stays that way. And you know something else that I thought about? What about the poor students in his classroom who had to actually assist him by holding down the limbs of this person, especially the limb that was going to be cut? After that 300% mortality rate procedure, it left a lot of his students very nervous. Rightfully so. I would have asked for a transfer. Whenever Liston called on a student to assist him in an amputation after that procedure, they all huddled nervously in the back of the room, praying to God that they would avoid being called on.
Jay Quellen. Where's Jay Quellen at? No Jay Quellen here?
See, they knew if they slipped even a little bit while holding that limb that's supposed to get amputated, it was slicey dicey time for them. That's right. I said it. I said slicey dicey time. You're welcome. But again, overall, he was a really good doctor. Liston died in 1847 at the age of 53 from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. He was a very harsh man and a perfectionist, and he had no issue criticizing his students and colleagues when they weren't doing as well as they should have been. But he was a genuine and caring person, and many people cared about him. Over 500 students, friends, and pupils attended his funeral when he died. And for almost 100 years after his death, Liston's life was celebrated with the Liston Medal for Surgery. It was an award given for surgical excellence at University College Hospital. Again, while Liston had some really fatal doozies, he was an outstanding doctor overall, and he made some great contributions to the medical field. He was the first person in Europe to perform a public operation with a patient using ether anesthesia. He also invented several medical tools, and he practiced hygienic methods in the operating room before it became common practice. He also operated on patients that other doctors gave up on, and he really emphasized the importance of not only the patient's physical well-being, but also mental well-being as well. Having surgery back then was a very terrifying experience for patients, even more than it still is today. And Liston, he was aware of this. During this time, it was believed by doctors that the greater the pain that the patient experienced, the better they would heal after the procedure was done, which is just... woo, that is a terrifying notion. Liston was one of the few doctors that did not believe this theory. If the patient was even experiencing feelings of dread before he actually did the procedure, he would either cancel it altogether or he would reschedule it for another date when the patient's mental state was in a much better place. He believed that it was important to not treat his patients like they were just a piece of meat, and that the actual challenge of surgery was not during the surgery, but what was to come after it, the follow-up health care, ensuring that the patient's quality of life and their health care was on point. And that is the story of the Victorian surgeon who was known for having a 300% mortality rate, a record no one has beaten to date, and let's hope it stays that way. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will be back hopefully within the next 2 weeks. I mentioned in my last video that I'm moving. As you can see here, the boxes are slowly swallowing me up, and depending on how the upcoming move goes, I'm hoping that I'm able to upload again within the next 2 weeks, but if I don't, it's just because, I'm trying to get my shit together in a different state. So wish me luck. Thanks for watching. Bye.